just crazy things like that. So it's a great thing to do. And even now that I work in the studio, both studios have that same red toolbox. Each one of them have a toolbox because it's just easier because I just know everything in there to go find the supplies that I need. So an emergency kit is definitely a good idea. All right, so when you get outside, we want to talk about lighting and choices and how we actually determine where we're going to shoot and why we shoot. So let's talk a little bit about making decisions on the lighting conditions before we show you the types of lights we use. The first thing I'm going to do, the way I teach photography, is that when I get outside, I call it evaluating the universe. The universe to me is everything you see, and I want to make decisions based on the universe. What's going on out there? I'm looking for light and light quality. So my goal is to find a location that creates balance in the universe. So we're looking for the same exposure range. We don't want a super bright sun and a super dark shady area. If the sun is, you know, 1 billion degrees behind you and you're putting kids in shade, we know what's going to happen. That's going to totally blow out. So one of the first things I teach photographers is shoot into the dark. Now, this is just really revolutionary, and I know, especially in the industry now, everybody's all about the sun flares and that whole 70s kind of retro-y looking thing, and that's cool. I think that's great. But I think if you were to really look at people's work, there's more misses than hits when you're doing that. So I'm always safety first. My opinion is find something. If you're shooting into something darker than the exposure of your subject, you do not have to deal with retouching and fixing and dealing with problems in the back. So when I walk outside, I'm looking for a nice grove of dark trees back there. I'm looking for something darker than the skin tones of my subject, because what I know is by darkening the background, and I'm not saying pitch black, I want texture and tonality, but if it's slightly darker than my subject is going to be brought forward, correct? So they're going to be more prominent and have a little more depth and detail. Now, once I get those perfectly sellable shots out of the gate, then I'm going to take them out into the sun and spin and dance and bright sun and high-speed sync and get all those really cool, you know, funky, fun shots that it's okay if I miss a few. But right out of the gate, my goal is clean lighting, and especially with family photography. This is one where, you know, when you get the hatchety lighting and all those difficult things that you're dealing with, you know, you could just control all of that by shooting into the dark. Find a shady location and shoot into something dark. And it could be a building. I mean, honestly, I've shot with garbage cans behind, but if you blow them out of focus and they're darker, that subject really seems to jump off. So the very first thing I'm going to do is evaluate the universe. The next thing I'm going to do, because we're talking about working with multiple subjects, is I'm going to determine my aperture. Now, aperture determines the depth and the depth of field in the image, how much is going to be in focus. Now, this rule, and this is honestly the truth, this is the only thing I can say I've given this industry that came out of my brain, because frankly, it's so elementary and dumb that it probably had to be mine. But I used to struggle teaching aperture because most of us know that the whole stop down, open up, it's backwards to us. It doesn't make sense making it smaller to get bigger and bigger to get smaller, and people really struggle with that. And I used to try to teach it, and I studied very hard, so I completely understand it, but to teach it is hard. And so when I started teaching it, I would get up on stage and I would just see, you know, blank stares. I'd get to this part and I'd say, "Do you guys understand?" They're like, and I knew there was a disconnect there. And so with my own photographers, I had a long time ago, because these guys, they'd come in, we'd be doing events like, you know, proms and things like that. And this was something that came out of an emergency, because one of my shooters, I thought they were more skilled, they were newer, and I thought they were more skilled. And when they asked me a really dumb question, I was like, "Are you kidding me?" I said, "Just do me a favor. Make sure that your aperture is either the same as or greater than the amount of people in the picture." Now think about that. That is so elementary, but for a lot of people, it's a huge light bulb when you actually think about it. Because if you have 4 people, what should the minimum aperture be? Nope. You can go lower than that or open up more than that. 4. Exactly, 4. If you have 6 people, what's the minimum aperture?
6.
8.
Correct. 5 people?
5.6.
5.6, yes, you got it. So and 8 is better, obviously, but I'm saying, what if you're in a low light situation? What if the sun's going down and you're running out of light? Well, you've got to get at least have the same or greater than aperture than the amount of people, and that works. If you have 20 people on a photo shoot, what's your minimum aperture? What are you shooting for? 22, right? You're going to try to get that 22. Now, can't always get it. It's a lighting issue. You know, the real benefit that a lot of newer shooters don't understand is back when we were film, you couldn't go past ISO 400. It would fall apart. So it was just not an option. So we were stuck. We had to come in with lighting because we knew that we were going to have a problem. Where nowadays, to push a camera to 500, 600, 1200 even, it's not totally impossible. So the thing is now you have more options than we had, but it is, we've struggled with keeping images in focus over the years, and we've kind of come to the conclusion that f8 does it. You know what I mean? Even with little ones, especially with busy little ones, we shoot at f8 because, you know what, I figure, yeah, we're sacrificing a little bit of that bokeh in the studio, not so much on location, we still can pull it off, but the security of knowing that ear to ear, we're gonna have strong, sharp eyes with beautiful eyelashes. I will sacrifice a little creativity for that tack sharp because I want to sell this. I don't want to sell this, and I want to make sure that we have that. So aperture is the second thing typically I'm thinking about when I go outside. First the universe, then the aperture. How many people do I have? And that's where I'm going to set it. And then, of course, from there, the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to meter for the ratio. So we're going to actually look at the shutter speed. And of course, the ratios would be that foreground, midground, background. As I said before, it's a terribly bright day and you put children in the shade and there's a tree that has this small patch, maybe the size of this rug, and the kids are right there and they're perfectly in shade, but the grass directly in front of their feet is just brighter sun burned out, and the grass behind them and all the trees behind them are burned out. You could expose for their face, and if they're 5'6" on the face, we know that the sunlight back behind them is f22. The difference in apertures is so great that everything in front of them is burned out, everything in back of them is burned out. You're losing all texture, all detail, and all depth in the image. When you blow out an image, you lose detail, and when you lose detail, it cannot be brought back. Now, Jack Davis, I was on tour last fall with Jack Davis, and he blew my mind with what he could do with Lightroom. The new Lightroom is so powerful, it's unbelievable, but even still, there is a limit. If all detail is gone, if you've blown something out and there is no detail, you cannot get it back, no matter what you do. So that's something to consider, is not just where the subject is, but what's happening in front of them and what is happening behind them as well. And I should finish up the third thing. It should say shutter speed up there, and I'm not sure why I ditched that, but the shutter speed obviously is what stops motion. So after I've selected my aperture, then I'm going to have to determine what shutter speed I need. Now, typically we shoot outside, we start at 1/25th. Depending on the light and what we're dealing with, we may have to change that, but 1/25th is kind of our starting point. So let's say we have a very busy child, we're using natural light, we push it to 1/60th or 250. Then, of course, we're going to have to go back to the beginning and adjust our ISO to make up the difference. We're not going to change our aperture because, remember, we need to keep the sharpness that we've determined we need. So we toggle between shutter speed and ISO, and we try to not play with the aperture too much. Now, that is for mechanical shooting. That's for the I want to get this right shooting. I also have the creative shooting where I'm like, oh, 2.8, and let's just have some fun, and we want it all fancy and out of focus, and that's a different style. But again, I will always do the safety shots first, the sellable images first, and then I will do whatever I want, because if the kids crash or I don't get it, there's no loss there whatsoever. Okay, so when it comes to lighting on location, there are lots of tools that you can use. For many, many years, all I had was that piece of cardboard and aluminum foil, and it worked just fine. Film handled light very different. I shot film for 13 years. I was a medium format shooter, RZ67, the big old, I started with an RB67 and then went to the RZ67, but these cameras were big dogs, 2 3/4 film negative this big, and that's how I started photography. Now, cameras like that had a lot of limitations, something that digital shooters will never understand. We were very much we had parameters that we had to work with. Now, film saw light very differently, and many occasions a lighter was enough, a reflector was enough. And that's primarily what I used to do all of my sessions. I also think back then, as much as I would say that that was enough, I also don't think I had the eye that I have now for light detail. I think what I thought was good enough was probably not good enough for the most part. I mean, shadows and things like that, I don't know that I had those mastered like I can see them now. And so at that time, that's all I could afford. It was primarily a reflector. Eventually, I started with the Q flashes. I started with Metz's, then Q flashes. And now I'm definitely switching over to the Canon system all the way. But I'm in that transitional period right now. The 580s were awesome, but now what the new flashes can do, the high-speed sync option alone is just the most thrilling thing, because high-speed sync, you see all these amazing wedding shots with those blue skies and those awesome vibrant colors, or these high school seniors that are like edgy, standing out in the middle of a street, in the middle of an intersection, in the middle of 12 o'clock noon, and it's dark and it's edgy, and their exposure and the blue sky is balanced. For us baby shooters, that's not an option. We're not going to stick a kid in the hot sun and blast them with the reflectors. So having that high-speed sync option is definitely going to be a good thing. Now, like I said, the reflectors were my original choice, and I still use them. Like Helen and I, when we're shooting, for the most part, we have a child like Sasha yesterday, it'd be a reflector, because flash is something that as the light goes in and out, you're paying attention to the child, and all of a sudden it's over and it's under, and there's just a change, a global change in the work, and we do have a lot of clouds. We have to deal with a lot, and you guys have probably very, very similar cloud patterns here. And so you just have that constant shift in the color and the tone of the image. So a reflector gives you a softer, more neutral feel, and it has less of that stark, that stark feel to it, and it's easier to see, honestly. So most of the time, if it's an easy session, we'll just grab a reflector, put it on a stand like this. We do have sandbags and weights to hold them down, and that works really, really well for us. So that would be our first choice. But when you get 2, 3, 4 busy children, a family, something where you want a little more control, then switching over to the flash is definitely a good idea. As I said, I used Q flashes for a lot of years, and I'm going to show you a video to kind of show you how to set up the Q flash, because a lot of photographers struggle with where does it go, how do you place it, how high is it, etc. So I want you to pay attention to the details here, because there are some rules as far as placement. The old school photography rules, let's see if any of you guys know, old school photography books, when they tell you where does your light go, if you're using a studio strobe, where would you place it? Does anybody know?
Kind of like where the sun would normally be, or?
Kind of, but if I'm standing here, if I was standing right here, where would my light be placed? What's the old school rule? Come on.
45 degrees.
45 degrees, you got it. So your light would be 45 degrees off camera. That's just old school. That really goes back to when we used big umbrellas and things like that. It just gave a very flat, safe, neutral light. So 45 degrees off camera, and your kicker or fill light would be directly behind the camera, slightly behind you, closer to the main light side. So you were creating directional light. The main light was creating the bulk of the light. The fill light was filling in the shadows, but we weren't doing this, flat blast it from both sides. And so that is kind of how I was trained to use lighting. But when it came to strobes and taking them out on location, it was a matter of, how do I do it? Is it 45? Where does it go? So I started really studying, and I learned from a lot of great wedding shooters. And the nice thing about wedding photographers is they're like running and gunning. They have to learn quickly, and if they make mistakes, it's a big problem. So I was trained by wedding shooters that it is about 45 degrees off. The flash itself is slightly higher than the subject and slightly angled down. Now there's a reason for that. What it does is it directs the shadows. If I put it to the side and shoot a flash across somebody's body, everybody's done it. You have those big ugly shadows on the neighbor's shirt, you know what I mean, where it's like this blue shadow that shifts over, and you can see it on their faces and on everybody, and it can get pretty bad. Well, when you raise the light and shoot it down, what happens is the shadows still exist, but they're pushed into the natural crevices of the body. So instead of going across the body and being obvious, they look like they're just natural areas in the body. So it lessens that power. So let's go ahead and look at the video, because it explains a lot of what I'm saying. Today we're going to talk about the Q flash. Now the Q flash is a tool that we use to get more light. Q flash does several things. Number one, it gives us more control. Now when I went digital, I found right away that I was having problems with color casts in the shadow. Early morning light with blue, we were having a lot of blue in the shadows, and late afternoon we were having a lot of that amber gold color in the shadows. So I found that I needed some sort of alternative light source to control that. So I went to the Q flash. Now the Q flash creates a pure white light. It creates a clean and consistent light. It gives me more light to work with, therefore creating better exposures. Now the Q flash that I'm using is the T5D. Now the T5D I have connected to a quantum battery. This is a turbo battery. The turbo battery and the Q flash are attached to this easy bracket. This is from Just Right Brackets. We're also using the Pocket Wizards. The Pocket Wizards allow the Q flash and the camera to talk to each other, so there are no wires in between. Now let's talk a little bit about using the Q flash. First of all, to get started, I prefer to shoot at an aperture of about 5.6 when working with children outside, at a 60th of a second. So I'm going to work in the manual mode today. Now there are all kinds of modes on the Q-Flash. A lot of fun things can be done, but when I'm working outside, I need to control all the variables. Now in the manual mode, we can work within one